gold. And when you think about the fact that this soil probably took hundreds of years to form,
Hello, my name is Christine Brown. I'm a field crop sustainability specialist.
good day. And on behalf of Christine Brown, myself, Andrew Barry, and the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Agribusiness, we'd like to welcome you back to 2025 March Manure Mondays. We had a great start last week, and we're glad to be back today. Same time, but actually it may be a different time due to daylight savings that we have here in Ontario and New York and other places. So our clocks moved ahead an hour. So if we all look like we have a little bit of red in our eyes, now you'll know why. Some quick logistics before we jump in today. These sessions are recorded and we do post them on OMAFRA's Field Crop News YouTube channel. You will get a link to that sent out in the upcoming emails. And in fact, the first session has been posted already, and I know a few of you have watched it. At the end, we will post a couple of QR codes. So one is the Certified Crop Advisor credit, and that's for one nutrient management credit. And there'll be a second one today, which is a KSE QR code. If you have no idea what that is, don't worry about it. It doesn't apply to you. But for those that are part of a funding program we have in Ontario, it means that this is a knowledge sharing event recognized for that funding program. So look for those posted at the end. Main thing is we do like to see you engage through the chat. So your questions, your comments, please do stay muted, but boy, love to hear your comments there. So last week, week one, we had Andrew Vanderzag from Agriculture Agri-Food Canada, and he talked about manure storages and methane, and that was a great start. Today, we're switching gears a bit, and we're talking about fine-tuning manure nutrient availability. So you can see our speakers on the screen here with me, and this is great to have these speakers back. So Kirsten Workman and Quirine Ketterings, both from Cornell. I had the chance to meet you both in Ontario in person back in January as part of the Eastern Ontario Crops Conference, and thank you for coming to join us there. And that was such a good session that Chris and I thought, boy, we need to include this as part of the mix for this year's Manure Mondays. So they're here, and I know they've brought some others with them, and I'm going to turn it right over to you. Take it away, Quirine and Kirsten.
Thanks,
Thank
Andrew.
you. Thanks, Andrew. We're gonna dive right in by showing you the four of us. It's four of us presenting here today. Juan Carlos Ramos Tanchez is the on-farm research coordinator for the Nutrient Management Spear team here in campus. Gurpreet will be presenting on part of her PhD work. She's a PhD student within our team. Kirsten works for ProDairy as the Nutrient Management and Environmental Sustainability Specialist, and I am the team lead for the Nutrient Management Spear program and a professor here. You'll see a lot more names here, and in actual reality, I want to say thanks to the entire crew of our program. We'll be sharing a lot of information about different projects here, all manure related, that cannot be done by one or two people only. So we have a summer crew, summer interns and students that we work with year round, extension educators, and of course the farmers that we work with for the on-farm research. We put an outline together for today. A little bit of background on New York agriculture, dairy agriculture that Kirsten will be diving into. Nutrient value of manure itself, a statewide project that we have in place that Juan Carlos will be talking about. Microbial activity, that is Gurpreet's PhD topic, and she will be presenting on that. Soil health across manure and no manure sites, Kirsten will take over. And a single slide for a new project that we are embarking on this year before we wrap up.
Awesome. Thanks, Quirine. So just for those of you who aren't from the Northeast or New York, I just wanted to give you just a little bit of background and context for the work that we're doing here at the Nutrient Management Spear Program and Pro Dairy at Cornell University. So we are primarily working with dairy farms and dairy manure. That's the kind of the driver behind agriculture in New York State. And if you go to the next slide, Quirine, we can talk a little bit about what that looks like. So go ahead and hit next and we'll give you the highlights. We have about, just over 30,000 individual farms across New York State. Just under 3,000, closer to 2,500 are dairy operations. And of that, we have about 630,000 dairy cattle. Milking cows, and that they are made up of all sorts of different sizes of farms. So of about those 2,500, roughly 500 of those are CAFOs, and we are 5th in the country for milk production in the United States. And what's that look like for crops? So this team, we work a lot with crop production and nutrient management. Go ahead and hit next. We've got about, in 2024, we had 570,000 acres of corn grain, 445,000 acres of corn silage, so altogether just about 1 million acres of corn, about 1.5 million acres in hay or haylage, and then on the rise, we now have 370,000 acres in soybeans. Next. So yeah, I mentioned, this is a map of a little bit of an older map, but gives you an idea of how that dairy production is spread out across our state. You'll notice in that northeast portion of our state is kind of blank. That's the Adirondack Park. So not a lot. One dairy farm actually located in the park, one of our CAFOs, but for the most part, we are kind of across the middle portion of our state. You'll see Western New York and that sort of central Finger Lakes region have a lot of our dairy farms here in the state. And we do have a medium, so 300 or more cow CAFO permit in New York and the 700 or more CAFO permit for large farms in our state. Water and clean water is really important to us here. We have both very abundant and important aquifers, which you see on the map there, that provide drinking water for residents of our state, as well as some very important surface waters that provide drinking water as well. And I'll talk a little bit about surface water and how we approach it next, but just to know that we do actually have 2 of only 6 unfiltered surface drinking water sources in the whole country are located in New York State. One is in the Finger Lakes region, Skinny Atlas Lake, and then one in the New York City watershed where the farmers of Delaware County actually are protecting the reservoirs for the water that goes to the residents of New York City downstate. Go ahead and hit next. So, we are the headwaters. If you see that map there with a tippy top of the Chesapeake Bay watershed, which many people hear about, right? And we are the headwaters of that watershed, and we're all somewhat familiar with the water quality pressures surrounding ag and manure. Lots of focus on phosphorus, but also nitrogen. And so we take that very seriously here in New York State. In addition to the Chesapeake Bay, we have 2 Great Lakes watersheds. We have the Finger Lakes, we have Lake Champlain, and many other smaller watersheds that are important water resources here. And most of those major water bodies are either under a TMDL or total maximum daily load plan, or the state's version of that, which we call a 9-element plan, to protect and plan for phosphorus, nitrogen, E. coli, and other challenges in those watersheds. So that plays into a lot of the work that we do and how we allocate and manage our manure resources on farms in New York State. So with that, we're going to kick it off, and Juan Carlos is going to share the nutrient value of manure project that's underway currently.
Thank you, Kirsten. Next slide, please. So to begin with, manure is a great fertilizer. It is not just NPK. It has all 17 nutrients that a plant needs. I think about it as a digested plant that has all the nutrients that a plant needed to grow. So it has NPK, but also some other more. It is a great fertilizer. All of these nutrients are important and play a role on having good yields. Next, please, Quirine. And then manure can have an important role on reducing the reliance on synthetic fertilizer, increasing sustainability, building soil health, climate resiliency, but still it has challenges. It is not as an inorganic fertilizer source that has a fixed composition. So with this project, we were looking at how variable manure is and how often we should measure in manure composition. And to do this, we worked with 4 New York dairy farms, and we were collecting samples from either the manure spreader or the pumping equipment sending the manure to the field. We were filling a 5-gallon bucket and collecting 3 subsamples, and we worked with 5 farms, and here is a summary of the conditions of those farms. They had different animal types, different manure collection and storage systems. That's the description in the middle of this table, and then if you see the right side of the table, we have the volumes that were applied during our sampling periods. We were working with different sizes of farms, and we were collecting samples in 2 intensities. One was a daily sampling, so that means that we were collecting one of those buckets a day, grabbing those 3 samples throughout the spreading season. But we also had an intense sampling day where we were sampling manure every 2 hours just to tap into the variability within one day, and the volumes that the farms were applying throughout the study were between 2 million for the smaller farm and 16 million gallons for the larger farm. And next, please. So diving into the results, first here we have one farm, Farm D, and on the y-axis of this graph we have the nutrient amounts in pounds per 1,000 gallons, and then on the x-axis we have total nitrogen, and you can see that there are 4 columns there. Each of them is representing one storage unit. So this farm had 4 storage units with manure. And as you can see there, there's quite a variability between the different storage units, with the storage 2 with way more nitrogen compared to 1 and 3. We saw something similar for P2O5, a couple of lagoons with way more nutrient concentration in storage 2 and 4. Versus 1 and 3. And this is telling us that we should be sampling manure per storage unit because their composition is going to be different. They have different management. Some might be storing lagoon manure for longer periods, more rainwater, and that impacts manure composition. And next, please. So now in this graph, we are comparing our sampling for the daily one versus the intense hourly sampling that we did. So now on the y-axis, we have the coefficient of variation, and the higher the coefficient of variation, the more variability we found within the samples we took. So the higher the graph, the bar, the more variability. So here we're going to focus to begin with the total nitrogen on the left side of this graph. And we are showing results for 3 farms. So in blue is Farm A, storage unit 1, and that's the value for the daily sampling. So across different days, it has a coefficient of variation above 15%, versus the same storage within 1 day, it was around 6%, so way lower variability within 1 day. Something similar for B23, lower variability within 1 day versus among different days. And then if we move into P2O5, we saw something similar for Farm A and B23. And on Farm C, not a lot of variability, but this farm was doing solid liquid separation, so that probably played a role there, and not a lot of variability for potassium. So sample daily, not hourly, because there's less variability within 1 day, more variability among several days because we are moving a larger volume of manure that brings those changes in the composition. Next, please. How about agitation? So we were able also to work with what farm that was agitating. So we saw 3 agitation scenarios there. Now on the y-axis, we have pounds per 1,000 gallons on each of the nutrients. And I'm going to start with the scenario number 1. This is a previous agitation. So I'm going to call this day 0. So the day before they began applying manure, they were agitating the storage unit. And here we can see that it has the highest contents of total N, P2O5, and also dry matter. Because of that agitation when they were applying on day 1, when they began the application. Then if we move in the middle, the second scenario is just agitation. So this is day number 2, moving away from that day 0 previous agitation. Here we see that the total N was a little lower compared to the previous scenario. Also, P2O5 was lower, went from 4 pounds to 2.5. K2O didn't change much, and also dry matter was getting lower. It went from 4.5 to just 2% dry matter. And then on the rightmost side, we have a no agitation scenario. So we were also able to sample one day where the farm wasn't agitated. And here we saw the lowest volume, the lowest concentration for total N, P2O5, and also a dry matter of just 1%. K2O didn't change a lot. So for this, we can conclude that no agitation means that we are going to be moving a lower amount of nitrogen and P because they're settling. And also, we saw changes in dry matter that were correlated with the changes in total N and phosphorus. Next, please. So the conclusions from this study, manure composition is going to be different across farms, but also across different storage units within the same farm. So we should sample per storage unit. We should be sampling across days, not within the same day, because we didn't see a lot of variability within 24 hours. Then agitation helps have homogeneous manure, have a more consistent nutrient content, so that helps to know how much nutrients you are land applying. Try to sample as close to land application. We were sampling here during land application, so that's also even better because you know the nutrients that are actually going into the field. And then sample manure when you see changes in dry matter composition that are likely going to correlate with those changes on phosphorus and total nitrogen, and also when you are doing manure transfers, moving manure from one storage to the other, that also will impact nutrient composition. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Quirine.
So Juan Carlos talked about the composition of manure and the importance of actually taking as best a sample as we can. In the next couple of slides, we're going to talk about what here in New York we do with the manure analysis once it's analyzed. How do we credit it currently? This is a slide that shows sort of the composition of manure, recognizing that there are different forms of nitrogen in manure. And if we look at the total nitrogen here, we have an ammonium N composition that behaves very much like a fertilizer. It's quick in becoming plant available. And then we have on the right side here 2 forms of organic N. In the middle is organic N that we expect to be plant available within a year, in the first year of application. And then we have some residual nitrogen, organic nitrogen, that could be mineralized over the years after the application. So the way we credit this right now is by saying for these organic sources, with regular manure, less than 18% dry matter, 35% available in year 1, and then 12 in year 2, and 5 in year 3. So it's 3 years of crediting on the organic side. In the inorganic side, since it behaves like fertilizer, it can escape on us fairly rapidly. So if we apply it to a growing crop, it could be equally available as fertilizer is. But if that's not the case, we apply before planting. Quick incorporation will really help capture a lot more of that inorganic nitrogen. And when we fall apply, whether we incorporate it or not, with our humid climate, we don't really carry nitrogen over to the next year. So this is the current recommendation system that we have in place. This is what was in place when I started working at Cornell almost 25 years ago now. And it recognizes that if we want to increase the value of the manure, we need to apply it close to a growing crop and get it in the ground, incorporation or injection. All right. The current system that we have in place, we've documented that in the form of a number of extension articles. This is a fact sheet that's on our website. Juan Carlos also took the lead developing an app where you can get this access to the QR code and basically get access to a calculator that allows you to enter information from manure analysis and then calculate manure credits. Back in 2016, one of our local producers, a dairy farm, came to me and asked about doing some on-farm research with a manure allocation piece of equipment. He wanted to test it, and with him we put this design in place. You will see here strips. There are 3 errors here. Those are 3 strips where manure was applied. And the other strips in between, there was no manure applied. So we have 3 strips with manure, and then they were subdivided into side-res nitrogen rates, ranging in this case from 0 to 175 pounds. So there were 6 subplots within each strip with different nitrogen rates. And this farmer happened to be a pilot as well. So he flew over this field and he snapped some pictures, and he was showing everybody who wanted to learn about it the visual message that came out of this. And one of the things he keeps pointing out when he shows this picture is this difference between the greenness of the 0 fertilizer in the manure strip versus the 175 pounds of fertilizer in the no manure strip, where it almost looks like the 0 looks better than the fertilizer. Now, of course, we don't base our trials on aerial images only. We actually did the yield assessments for this trial. And we did that 2 years in a row. In the second year, had 2 varieties in the study as well. And the main things here that came out of this made us aware that we needed to do some on-farm research that Juan Carlos will be talking about shortly. In brown is the strips that received manure. In gray are the strips that did not receive manure. And if we focus on the 2016 picture, we're basically showing that as the fertilizer rate went up, the yield went up for the strips that did not have manure applied. The strips that did have manure applied, the fertilizer did not improve the yield at all. It happened in 2016, it happened with variety A in 2017, and it happened with variety B in 2017 as well. So manure was definitely replacing fertilizer in these studies. But the other thing that was actually more important for us, because we know there's nitrogen in manure, was this yield bump. So if you look at the maximum yield achievable with fertilizer alone and you compare that to the yield we had with the manure, you see a yield bump. You see higher yields when manure was applied. And that was an important one for us to recognize and say, oh, maybe we need to take that into account in our manure application and guidance systems. Because our current crediting does not take that yield bump into account. So this was a really important study for us. There's something in manure that benefits the crop beyond what fertilizer alone was able to achieve. We have a write-up of this study, just in case you're interested in learning about this in more detail. There's a blog article that has a lot more details about this study in place. Our current observations, where we have a crediting system in place, it recognizes the value of manure, but it did not recognize the yield bump that we are seeing in these trials in 2016 and 2017. And we know there have been tremendous advances in manure treatment systems since then. Technology advanced, new manure sources, new application methods. It was time for a new project, and that's the one that Juan Carlos is going to talk about.
Thank you, Quirine. So with that as a background, we began the New York Value Manure Project on 2022. So we have already 3 seasons of data, and we already have trials lined up for 2025. So we're going to continue to do this research, and we are looking into 2 knowledge gaps. The first one is the need of information to update our nutrient creating system for manure with the sources that are available today and the application methods that farms are using today. So now we see things like anaerobic digestion, solid liquid separation. So we want to tap into those. And also we want to see what are the economics behind using manure, how it replaces fertilizer, what are the yield bombs, what's the silage quality benefits of using manure. So those are the main objectives of the project at the moment. So how our plots look like, pretty much very similar to the picture that Quirine showed before. So we have 6 strips. In this case, it's the graph on the leftmost side of the slide, and 3 strips receive manure. In this case are the 3 ones on blue, and then 3 don't. Those are the ones on yellow. So for this farm, we see in the middle a satellite picture of the manure application, and we see how they skipped the manure strips, those are dry, versus the manure ones where they apply a liquid manure, and they did the same for the rest of the field. Then the second layer of treatments is applied at site resting time, so when the corn is at the B4, B6 stage. And we do the same, we create 6 subplots for per strip, and each of them receives a different site rest rate. In the case of this farm, they were doing rates between 0 to 175. These ranges were farm specific, and we were adapting them to the nitrogen needs we were expecting for each of the fields we were working with. Between 2022 and 2023, we hosted 11 sites with a good distribution throughout New York State. Last year, we had 8 extra sites, and we are going to have more on 2025. Something important about this is that this project is part of our New York on-farm research partnership. We are working with farmers, with commercial farms. And this is very important because with the distribution we have across the state of farms we are working with, we are able to tap into different soil characteristics, different manure histories, and that these play an important role, and we'll see later why. Different weather conditions, different agronomic managements that the farms have. Manure sources, very important for this study. We have different ones, and also different application methods and timings. Next, please. So working with local farms, now precision agriculture tools also make this easier, and I think for me and for the team it's great to work directly with farms. We can learn about the problems, the challenges, and the opportunities they face, and also there's a lot of value on they see in research happening in their fields. So moving into what kind of farms we're working with, the table on the left are the manure types. We had 11 ones with liquid manure, 6 with digestate, a couple with compost. Then on the top right, the application rates, 2 farms with 30 tons an acre, 1 with a rate below 5,000 gallons, 9 farms with rates between 5 and 10K gallons, and 7 with rates between 10 and 15,000 gallons an acre. For the application methods, mainly injection with 9 farms, followed by broadcast plus incorporation for 8 farms, and a couple of farms that were only broadcasting manure. All of that was dairy manure. So with these trials, we were able to create these nitrogen response curves, similar to the ones that Quirine showed before. So we have yield on the y-axis and nitrogen rates on the x1. And we calculate the yield for this example. In brown, we have the manure strips, on gray, the no-manure ones. And based on the numbers that you see on the bottom of the slide, the price of a pound of nitrogen and the cost of a ton of silage or a bushel of grain, we calculate the most economical rate of nitrogen. So this is the box we have here. And that one is telling us what's the point where we have the highest economic return. So when adding extra nitrogen doesn't pay for the extra yield increase. So for the no manure strips, we needed 114 pounds of sidedress nitrogen for a yield of 28 tons and a half for this site. Versus in the manure ones, we needed 56 pounds of sidedress nitrogen for a yield of 29 tons. So then if we look at the difference between those two, we can see how much nitrogen manure was replacing. So in this case, 114 minus 56, 58 pounds of nitrogen that manure replaced. So now we're gonna dive into different scenarios, different responses we've seen. This is the first one. We saw no nitrogen response and no manure response in these three sites. So you don't see the typical curves. Here we see just a flat response. When we added extra sidedress, there was no yield increase. And also when we added manure, there was no yield increase as well. So this is telling us that the soil itself was providing all the nitrogen that the crop needed, so they didn't benefit from the extra we put down. On green there, we have the average for New York State is around 20 tons. And we can see that these three trials were way above that average here, so very high yielding sites that had also long manure histories, and that explains why there was no response to nitrogen or manure. The second scenario is our nitrogen responses and yield bumps. So this is similar to the first example I showed. I won't go in detail into all of them, but you can see that the brown manure strips were consistently higher yielding. They're a little bit above the gray ones in these trials. And also they were replacing nitrogen fertilizer in different levels depending on the rates and also the manure application methods that the farms were using, but consistently providing nitrogen and creating those yield increases. Next, please. So manure consistently doing that, offsetting fertilizer, increasing yield. The next scenario are these trials where we saw a very large yield bump. So if you see there, the gap between the brown and the gray response curves is quite large. So we focus on the one on the left. The most economical rate of nitrogen for no manure was 56 pounds of nitrogen for a yield of 12 tons and a half. Versus in the manure one, we needed 113 pounds, so extra 60 pounds of sidedress nitrogen, but that came with a higher yield, almost 5-ton increase compared to no manure. Something similar happened on the trial on the right. Here we see that the MERN was 90 pounds for a 155 bushel yield, versus manure one when we needed 103 pounds for a way higher yield, 176, so 20 bushel difference, but also that came with a 13 pounds of nitrogen extra need of fertilizer. These two trials were conducted on 2023. So large bumps that also resulting in a greater need of nitrogen fertilizer. Both sides had a medium potassium level in the soil. So the hypothesis was that there was a potassium deficiency that manure was covering, and that was unlocking the extra yield, but also the extra need of nitrogen. So with that in mind, in 2024, we were able to host trials in the same fields with no manure applied on the spring of 2024. So we were only testing the carryover benefits of the 2023 manure into 2024 corn, with the difference that also the farm applied a blanket application of potash in the spring to the whole field just to get rid of any potassium deficiency. Still, we saw a large increase in yields. If we compare the MERNs for the graph on the left, we needed 128 pounds of fertilizer for a yield of almost 23 tons and a half versus a yield of 21 tons in the no manure ones. Something similar in the trial on the right. a yield of 201 bushel versus 187 bushel in the no-manure ones, and actually a lower nitrogen need in the manure strips in the second year. So very positive effects of this carryover benefit of manure into year 2 after application. So with the results to date, we are seeing that yield responses to manure and to side-dress nitrogen are site-specific. We have 9 trials where we documented a response to nitrogen and also a yield bump due to manure application. 3 sites where we saw no manure response and no nitrogen response, but these were very high yielding sites with a longer manure history. And we saw a couple of trials where there was a large yield bump that also came with that higher nitrogen side-dress need, and something very positive in 5 trials where we had a carryover manure. So we applied the manure on year 1 and we were testing it on year 2. We still saw nitrogen responses and yield bumps due to that manure that was applied the year before. In the preliminary conclusions, we are seeing that manure can offset fertilizer needs. It is consistently boosting yield, and also we see that in the second year after the application of manure. Yield and nitrogen responses vary by location, and that's correlated with field history. Fields that have seen more manure in the past or also have past grades coming from cover crops and rotation are less likely to respond to manure and side-dress. And this is work ongoing. We have a large silage data set that we need to tap into, soil microbial health indicators that Gurpreet is going to be talking, and also we are trying to tap into what are the economics behind using manure, sustainability, nutrient efficiency indicators, and some tools to improve manure use and update our grading system here in New York. So with that, I'm gonna pass it over to Gurpreet to talk about her microbial activity work. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. So with all the nitrogen and manure responses, we have also been working on soil health indicators in the Valley of Manure project. And we are studying soil health indicators to answer a few key questions about how and what microbial health indicators can be used to identify and see when we would get a response to nitrogen or a yield increase upon manure application, and also how can we make crop responses more resilient in the coming years. And then so in 2023, we sampled 3 sites from the Bigger Valley of Manure project. So the 3 sites shown here, that is field A, B, and C, they show different fields. So field A, which showed us yield bump, that is yield response, and then to both manure and nitrogen application. Whereas for field B, we see there was a very small to almost like no yield nitrogen benefit from manure and both nitrogen application. And similarly for field C, there was only a small increase or response to yield and nitrogen. Coming to the manure histories of all the 3 fields, we see that field A had no manure history in the past, whereas field B and C, they had medium to longer manure histories. Field B was the one which had a few years of manure application in the past, whereas field C had a longer manure application history. And they were also located in 3 different locations in New York. And then next slide, please. For the soil sampling, the same protocol as Juan Carlos mentioned was followed, with 3 strips receiving manure and 3 strips did not receive manure. But specifically for the soil health sampling, we focused on collecting soil samples only from control and maximum, that is 0 pounds of nitrogen and maximum nitrogen in all the strips in the field. And then soil samples were also collected at planting, at pre-side dress, and at harvest of corn. To account for all the different aspects of soil health, soil fertility, we collected samples from 0 to 4 inches and 0 to 8 inches, and also 0 to 12 inches to perform pre-side dress nitrate test. From all the soil samples collected, we have been analyzing them for soil pH and nutrient analysis, pre-site risk nitrate test, and soil health indicators such as loss of ignition carbon, active carbon, microbial biomass, and then we are working on soil respiration and below ground biodiversity in all the fields. But in this presentation, I will be going on a few results: loss and ignition carbon, active carbon, and microbial biomass. So to begin with, we have loss and ignition carbon. Here we have field A, and as we go from top to bottom, we see the three sampling events. That is at planting, at pre-site rest, and harvest. And as we go from top to bottom, we see that loss and ignition carbon values remain almost consistent throughout the growing season. And then for field B, we see similar results where it remained the same and there were no significant differences among the manure and no manure strips. And for field C, we see that the initial values of loss and ignition carbon were higher as compared to field A and B. And it also remained consistent throughout the growing season. But this slide also depicts how different manure application histories can have different loss and ignition carbon values. Moving on to the active carbon, for we can see the similar results for field A, where the active carbon values remain consistent throughout the growing season. Similarly for field B and also for field C. But again, field C had initial higher values of active carbon compared to the other fields. Then moving on to microbial biomass carbon, we have been evaluating microbial biomass and fungal to bacterial ratios using an on-site testing kit. It is called microbiometer. It is a phone-operated kit which gives us values within 20 minutes of testing. And then we have been using it consistently for all the samples. And it shows something that is on the right of the screen, that is microbial biomass as micrograms carbon per gram of soil, and also fungal to bacterial ratios ranging from low to high. And then for field A, as we move from top to bottom, we see that initially field A, which is the field which has no manure history in the past, had lower microbial biomass values, but it increased over time from planting to harvest. And then for field B, we see that a similar increase was observed from planting to harvest, where we see some differences, numerical differences in manure versus no manure strips. And for field C, we see that the initial values for microbial biomass were higher compared to rest of the fields, and then it remained almost consistent throughout the growing season. Now, if we compare only one sampling event, that is at planting, for all the three fields, we see that there is a huge difference among the fields, where field A had no manure history and field C has had the longest manure application history, and we see it has higher microbial biomass compared to the other two sites. And then moving on to pre-site rest, we see that field A was the field which showed response to both manure application and nitrogen application at pre-site rest. And then we see now that field A is separated from field B and C as compared to the yield response that we saw before. Moving on to harvest, we see that all the three fields had almost similar microbial biomass values, but they were all very different in the beginning of the growing season. And then now the main thing that stands out from these results from the three sites in 2023, we see that the most striking difference was seen at pre-site rest, where we can clearly see how field A, B, and C were different from each other given their manure application histories and their responses to manure and site rest nitrogen application. And also we see field C had initial higher microbial biomass values given its longer manure application history. And then we also sampled 9 more trials in 2024, where some of the fields which have a cow icon received manure in 2024, and which do not have any icon, they did not receive any manure in 2024. There was one field with poultry manure, And as we move from top to bottom, there are three columns and they represent lower to medium to higher microbial biomass values. So we see that the fields which receive manure, the three fields, field 7, 8, and 9, they receive manure in 2024, and they also have higher microbial biomass values compared to field 1 to field 6. And then we can also see big differences in microbial biomass at planting, where it was lower and then it increased over time until harvest. And then we are also working on all the data collected in 2024 and to better understand how could microbial diversity and other soil health indicators can relate to the responses we have. So the preliminary conclusions from this study are that manure addition seems to be most effective in enhancing microbial biomass for the fields with longest manure application history. For example, field C, where we had longer manure application history. And also sampling at pre-citrus time, that is when corn is at its V4 to V6 growth stage, seem to give us more information about how manure application and nitrogen supply relate to microbial biomass. And then also we are evaluating the data from 2024 to see if the mid-season sampling can be used as an assessment to identify the input for additional nitrogen. Yep. And then with that, Kirsten can take over. Thank you.
Thanks, Gurpreet. Yeah, so I think, all of us that deal in manure and our farmers who do the same understand that those fields that receive manure seem to perform just differently, right, than our fields without manure. So building on what Juan Carlos is finding from just the nitrogen credits, we're really excited about Gurpreet's work because we were hoping to be able to explain some of that and then be able to use it as sort of a management decision tool in season and how it interfaces with that sort of nitrogen availability and field balances. So my colleague Joe Lawrence, who runs the corn silage hybrid trials for Pro Dairy at multiple locations across New York State, every year he notices the same thing as well. He's got some sites that have manure history and are located on dairy farms, and then we have one site in particular that's located on our research farm, which is a grain system and does not receive manure typically. And so we set out to use just 1 year of that trial to do some soil health assessments and see what we could figure out. And what you can see is that the 3 sites, the Aurora site, which is that grain system and has no manure history, and then the 2 sites that were located on operating dairy farms, all were on soil types that had a similar corn yield index, so sort of the average, what we would estimate as productivity. They were well matched. But if you go to the next slide, you can see that in real life, we noticed that all of these fields were performing above that sort of average yield amount, right? So the Aurora site saw 25 tons per acre, but our 2 dairy sites were 32 and 34 tons per acre. The other thing, and if you hit the next slide, I think the next button, Q, it'll go through. So yields were higher. We also noticed that while we don't manage N in corn silage for crude protein content, we were picking up that these manured sites had higher crude protein and a little bit better forage quality, that we would never suggest anyone fertilize corn silage to meet crude protein necessarily. That's not really what it's for. And then the other interesting thing was this idea of N balances. So when Joe does the N balances for these fields every year, what he was also noticing was that these manured fields were actually getting negative N balances. So they were kind of outperforming our calculated N credits based on what we had applied to the fields. They were out yielding what we were providing them in nitrogen. And I'll show you some numbers from the ACE soil protein measurement of the Cornell assessment for soil health that gets at a little bit of that. But this idea of having better N utilization and efficiency is something we noticed alongside Juan Carlos's work and Gurpreet's. So then, when we look at the overall soil health scores, we see that kind of bear out. And so if you go ahead and hit next Q, I'll dive into the imbalances in the soil health. So in this slide here, we're showing those same 3 fields. Again, the Aurora site is our non-manured site, and Madrid and Oakfield both have manure. And the colored bars are the amount of N we applied by source. So we have an N crediting system in New York. So based on soil type, crop rotation credits, manure applications, and fertilizer application, we add that up. And you can see that you can see that across the sites. And then the clear sort of bar with the green dashed outline is the actual crop uptake. And so here you just sort of see in a visual form that the non-manured field, we were not using all the nitrogen we applied in the crop, but in our 2 manured sites, we actually see negative imbalances. So in the Madrid location, we were utilizing 70 more pounds of nitrogen than we had calculated in the application, and about 39 pounds in the Oakfield site. So very highly, more than 100% efficient on calculated N credits, which is, I think, a place we're all interested in being. And then as we looked at the whole soil health, these are, if anyone's looked at the Cornell assessment of soil health, they have this sort of color-coded assessment and indices. And we do notice that the Aurora site has sort of medium soil health, where the Madrid and Oakfield both scored high on that scale. And so the question is, but why? What about manure is driving it? And you know, we think about soil health both in physical, biological, and chemical parameters. And Gurpreet talked about the biological, and I think that's important. You'll see here why. If you hit next Q, you know, when we look at the chemical, all of these sites, other than looks like maybe we had some pH issues at the Aurora site. I'd have to look closer at the soil test, but right, high fertility sites, they were scoring really well from a chemical fertility standpoint. And then we went on to the physical parameters, looking at aggregate stability, water availability, and compaction. Not a lot of like rhyme or reason there either. There is those red dots or the asterisk points there where might be some sampling issues on our penetrometer. But then if we look into the biological, right, then that's when we start to see this trend towards higher scores when we look at the manured versus non-manured sites. And that's why we're so excited in sort of understanding that piece better in the work that Gurpreet's doing in her PhD. And so what we'll see here too is similarly, right, when we look at that, what they call the ACE soil protein index, and that's you know, part of the soil health test, this autoclave citric extractable soil protein is like a function of very much available N to the crop. We see again that those manured sites tend to score better in that case. I think if you go ahead and go next, yep. And then if you look at the statewide assessment of soil health, they break up the results they get into categories, and pasture tends to score very high, as does these smaller mixed vegetable crop fields. But if you compare our dairy crop fields to our more annual grain and processed vegetable systems, they tend to score higher. You know, we think being driven by these applications of compost and manure, the integration of livestock, and then that better crop rotation because we had perennials in the rotation. So that might all be feeding, right, some of this improved soil health and performance and nitrogen efficiency.
So with that, we have just 1 or 2 slides left for a new project and then the wrap up. We are starting a new project this year. Juan Carlos is working with some farms and extension educators to try to get this project off the ground. We just recently got funded for it. And the new project is all about learning how to better quantify nitrogen supply and soil health indicators of these manured fields. We call it the Power of Manure project, and it's building soil and supply with manure, so trying to document field histories and evaluate the nitrogen supply, the growth potential of areas that do not get fertilizer, that totally rely on the manure supply itself. We have a couple of flyers on our website now and a protocol inviting people to participate. And if there's an interest in participation across the border, happy to work with local folks to share the same protocols with you all. With that, we've reached the wrap up really quickly before we leave a little bit of time for questions. We've seen through the presentation that manure can definitely offset fertilizer needs. And we've also seen a recurring boost of yield in fields that have manure. Manure is variable across farms, across storages within the same farm, and across spreading events. So frequent manure sampling is really important. Within reason, hourly sampling may be not necessary. Field history is important for evaluating the benefits of manure. Gurpreet's work is showing that manure addition was most effective in enhancing microbial biomass for field with the longest manure application in history. That field C was the only field where the manure application resulted in higher microbial biomass at the start of the season, and that should translate into benefits for the seed that you put in the ground at that time. Sampling at V6, V4, V6 seemed to be able to separate out the sites in terms of nitrogen responsiveness, and the 2024 database will need to be added to see if that is something that holds across multiple years. The manured fields showed higher soil health, better nitrogen utilization, yield bumps beyond manure nutrient content, and better organic matter quality. So a whole bunch of packages that come together that all point out to the value of manure, the benefits of the manure. With that, we want to thank all our sponsors for these various projects, as well as the participating farms and the many team members that helped collecting samples and processing samples for all these projects, and open it up to some questions.
Excellent. Okay, thank you to all four of you. And there have been many comments and questions in the chat, and you folks have started answering a good majority of those. Maybe I'll let you continue to do that because there are the four of you. Just a couple things. First of all, Kirsten, right off the bat, CAFO. That's a term that not everybody may understand. We don't use it so much in Ontario. Can you just explain what that is?
Yes, my apologies. So CAFO is our concentrated animal feeding operation. So any of those livestock producers that fall into that category, in New York, we have the medium, which is 300 or more. And anyone in the United States, if you're 700 or more, this is milking cows. And other animals, it's different numbers. You fall into a permit system so that you can comply with the Clean Water Act, administered by EPA, but generally through our state regulators.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you for that.
Mhm.
And I do want to say kind of a general comment. You know, for me, probably 30 years working in agriculture in the environmental field. And I wonder if you would say the same, but I cannot believe the change in general overall perspective of manure. When I started my career, you would be thinking about how do we deal with this waste? How do we get rid of manure? You know, how do we store it? And then it shifted to, oh my goodness, there's some environmental concerns around this stuff. How do we protect the environment from this stuff? And now, isn't it wonderful to be at the point where we're looking at, oh my goodness, you know, Juan Carlos, you listed all of the nutrients, and you could make a longer list when you go into the microbes and the organic matter and everything else. We're talking about the value of manure, and it's just phenomenal change I've seen. Any comments you want to make on that, anybody?
Well, I'll say we still struggle with that. I have conversations every day with folks that maybe aren't involved closely with agriculture, right? That still see that manure as a liability or a waste. And so I think that this work is particularly important, and partnering with Chris moving forward, I think will be exciting so that we really can show not just the nutrient value, but also all the other environmental benefits of using that on farm, you know, livestock produced organic fertilizer source.
Yeah, and the naming Power of Manure as the new project reflects that recognition too. There is tremendous value that we just need to better understand, and it's definitely being realized.
Yeah, absolutely. So you did mention as well, you had there was a manure calculator that you had as well. In Ontario, we have something called AgriSuite. Chris Brown, maybe you can put a comment on that in the chat, or a link to that. It's a software program that helps to basically use manure better in terms of the fertility value, getting the most out of it, applying it right. So there's some great tools out there on both sides of the border and in different provinces and different states. Check those out there. They're very good. I do have to mention my friend Wheat Pete's on the call, and Wheat wanted to make sure that wheat was included, Kirsten, in your stuff.
I saw that. Yes, we do have wheat in New York. 100,
Yeah,
I think I put the numbers in there.
135,000
135,000
acres.
acres still.
Yeah. So wheat's still in there. That's good good to know. So yeah, we're running out of time here. So folks, hopefully you were able to grab the QR code there if you're a CCA. There also is the knowledge sharing event that is on the screen right now. So if you don't know what that is, don't worry about it. But for those that are part of that funding program, you can take a look at that. There were many links in the chat, links to things to check out. We're going to include that as we post this recording, so you'll be able to circle back and see those links to the many things that were mentioned in the chat. We are at the end of our time here, so we do have to stop. Thank you very much to all of you, to Kirsten, Quirine, Juan Carlos, and Gurpreet. Great project, very interesting, more work to be done, but it is important work. Thank you for the time. Thank you for coming. And to everybody else, thank you for joining us on Manure Mondays. Join us back next week as we look at in-crop application using the Rain 360 technology. And that's with Scott Shear from Ohio State University. That is sure to be an interesting one as well. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great week.
Thanks for having us.
Cheers.
Thank you.